So some people are planners, like their whole life is driven by an organizational chart or by an agenda. They know exactly what they're going to get done. Other people kind of free spirits. They kind of fly, some would say by the seat of their pants, or they feel a little bit more like they can kind of decide on the whim. But at the end of the day, we all make plans. And one of the things that we have to remember about the way that God works is that He still orders our plans, even if we don't realize that He's doing it, that we make preparations, but God already has a plan in place. And the question is really, what does that look like? James says we're a vapor and that we're here today and then gone tomorrow. So what does that mean about our plans? Like, what does it mean when we put things together? So today, as you're thinking about this from Proverbs chapter 16, the author of Proverbs says this: all a person's ways seem pure to them, but motives are weighed by the Lord. Then again at 16 verse 9, he says, in their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. And you know, one of the things I think that's challenging for us is that we all kind of want to be the captain of our ship. Like, we want to be the ones directing everything. And God does this unique thing that He still lets us, even though He still has a plan for us. And the real question is whether or not our plans line up with His. And so today, my prayer really more than anything else is that you would think about that the plans of the heart, they're great, but the Lord weighs their motives. And we may all have kind of direction we want to go in, but God has a plan for us. And today I'm challenging you to consider what that might be. I think it's in our nature to be argumentative. I think maybe that came from the fall in some ways. I think also, though, there's a part of us that wants to correct something we see that's wrong, that actually that probably came from being made in the image of God. But the reality is we just seem to argue, and anybody who's had a sibling knows that this is true. Like, we are prone to argue over the most foolish things. But the fact is that what we say, and sometimes what we don't say, are great ways of starting a fight. And yet at the same time, they're also ways of quenching a fight, keeping it from being a fight. The author of Proverbs chapter 17 addresses this in verse 4 when he says, starting a quarrel is like breaching a dam. So drop the matter before a dispute breaks out. It also says in verse 27, the one who has knowledge uses words with restraint, and whoever has understanding is even tempered. You know, it's incredible. It's the thought of knowing that I have more control over the way a conversation goes because I get to choose my words. I can't choose somebody else's, but I can choose my own. But I can also choose my reaction or my response to those words. Years ago, there was a great illustration someone gave me that talked about how we deal with problems in life. And a lot of times when we don't realize it, but we carry two buckets around with us. One has water and one has gas. And we have the opportunity when there's conflict to either pour water on that conflict and so wash out that conflict, or to pour gas on that conflict and make it even worse. And I would argue the opposite is true. Sometimes in our lives, people need their fire fueled. They need to be encouraged. So they need to have that water poured on that, and or that gas poured on it. And still other times, people need to be reminded that they're important and that they're valuable. And if they're feeling the weight of the world on them, that fire that's raging within them that won't go away, sometimes we need to pour the water on it so that it brings peace. Again, the whole idea with the proverb is to be mindful of our words. He says, starting a quarrel is like breaching a dam, so drop the matter before it breaks out. Or the one who has knowledge uses words with restraint, and whoever has understanding is even tempered. I think it's great for us to remember how powerful our words can and cannot be. Go in peace. So if you're anything like me, you love watching a movie where the underdog, like at the end of the movie, really comes out on top. Like, this is a person you've watched and you've hoped that because of all the things they're facing, the adversity and the things that are happening to them, you want to see them overcome. And I think that's because naturally within all of us, we have a sense of that. We have a sense of we are the underdog. Even if your environment maybe is a little bit different, we look around and we think to ourselves, I can relate to that. And for many of us, it's this idea of we desperately want to make sure that our lives are in the right order. But the only way that that's going to happen and the follower of Christ for them is for them to run to God, to acknowledge that no matter what they accomplish, unless God is the strength of who they are, it's never going to last. But the other thing is that God actually wants us to feel the power of His presence and the ability to remain confident in Him. In Proverbs chapter 18, it says, "The name of the Lord is a fortified tower. The righteous run to it and are safe." I think for so many of us, it's a reminder to us that God does long for us to feel safe in His presence. The psalmist in Psalm 23 talks about the importance of that. And then even Jesus would say that He's the good shepherd. And so the whole idea is that God longs for us to feel that way, but the only way that we can truly feel that is to run to Him. And to run to Him is to run to Him in confidence, regardless of what we've done, regardless of where we've been, regardless of what we're facing, that in Him is this strong, fortified tower. And when we run to Him, we know with confidence that we're safe, no matter what we come to Him with. Love you. Go in peace. So my kids will say to me that it's real evident to them when I'm upset because they see it all in my face. They hear it after the fact, but they can always see it in my face. And I think one of the things too that's really true of us is that, when we're in a place where someone that's talking to us exercises authority over us, when they get mad at us, we all kind of tend to react in a very similar way. Maybe out of defense, we react in anger or frustration, or maybe we draw back because we feel like we're being criticized for something and we don't have a defense for it. We just feel like less of a person. One of the most important things to recognize, though, is that if you are the person who has that authority, that it's very important to be careful with the way that we carry that authority, because at the end of the day, people will respond based on how we are treating them. And people get defensive because they feel like they have to be. Other people cower away because they're not sure that they're strong enough to handle it. There's a great passage in Proverbs 19. It says, "A king's rage is like the roar of a lion, but his favor is like dew on the grass." Proverbs 19:17 says, "Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord. He will reward them for what they have done." I think it's important to think about in our lives, especially for me as a parent, or even as a husband, the way that I talk to my kids or my wife oftentimes will feel like a sense of encouragement to them or a sense of fear. And in this particular case, obviously, a king's rage is like the roar of a lion, but his favor is like dew on the grass, has a mixture of two things. Number one, the king was the one in authority. So if he brought the rage, it was because he needed to, or because, again, he didn't know how to manage his emotions. But the outflow of his emotions was that the people themselves felt terrified, felt unsure. But then when the king came with favor and encouragement, it was refreshing, like dew on the grass. And remember, it's not refreshing to us because we step out on it and it's wet and we hate it, but it's refreshing to the grass. And so for many of us, it's important to remember that. Again, whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and He will reward them for what they've done. What I love about this is if you go back to Proverbs 19, you find that the author of Proverbs is talking a lot about the poor, but he's talking about them in terms of them being lazy, and in terms of their attitude toward things. And in particular, not just poor people as the state of their being, but of their attitude. But in this particular case, he speaks of the poor of those that people care for and are mindful for. And I want to challenge you today to think about different ways that you can tend to the poor. Remember, poor is not necessarily about what's in their pocket, but what they feel in their heart. And if a person feels like they're worthless, how could you give to them to help them feel that they're not? And remember, in doing so, you honor the Lord. God bless you. Go in peace. As a parent, I have noted with my kids as they grow up, I've had different stages of things I allowed them to do or allowed them to experience. And when they got to a certain point, when they could recognize that their siblings who were older than them were being treated differently, they might say to me, "Hey, Dad, that's not fair. Why do they get to do that and I don't?" And what that amounted to was an opportunity for me, again, to explain that things are handled differently and looked at differently, but it didn't mean necessarily that I changed the scales. I just explained to them how it broadened for them. In other words, when we talk about life, sometimes what we end up dealing with is that we come across with this idea of, well, that's not fair, but then we wonder, well, is it or is it not? Or are the measurements wrong? Sometimes in life, what we have are people that love to just abuse other people. They love to reduce other people down to what they can manage and what they feel like is justifiable. And so they change the measure. And so they might judge someone a little bit differently than they would for someone else, just based on their own sort of faulted scales. In Proverbs chapter 20, it says, differing weights and differing measures, the Lord detests them both. In Proverbs chapter 20, verse 14, it's no good, says the buyer, then goes off and boasts about the purchase. But Proverbs chapter 20, verse 12, probably explains why the Lord hates dishonest scales. It says, ears that hear and eyes that see, the Lord has made them both. You see, the big challenge sometimes with the way that we treat one another and the things that we do is that we forget that in our interaction with one another, those who follow after Christ acknowledge that every person is made in the image of God. So when the proverb author says, ears that hear and eyes that see, the Lord has made them both, the argument is to say that whoever you deal with, God has handcrafted them. That's why the Lord hates differing scales or measurements. That's why the Lord hates injustice. That's why the Lord is opposed to racism. That's why the Lord hates gender issues that result in women being displaced because they're women or men being disregarded because they're men. God hates all of those scales because we were all made in the image of God, and that our design is to weigh out life based on His measurements. See, at the end of the day, how you and I treat each other is actually saying more about what we think about God than it is about other people. So something to remember today as you consider the Lord hates dishonest scales. Why? Because dishonest scales creates a space where the image of God is ultimately worked against. God bless you. Go in peace.